in 2 languages. That will be in English and French. Please click on the interpretation button and then select your preferred language. You can also kindly keep your microphone muted unless you have been given the floor to speak. And also please put off your video and only activate it when you are indeed speaking. I'd also like to encourage you to use the reactions function we have at the bottom of the screen. And also don't hesitate to make use of the chat box function for your comments and questions, right? Let's get straight into it and discuss why we are all here today. This webinar also aims to discuss the EI Africa Framework for Social Dialogue and to solicit your suggestions in order to strengthen and validate the framework. Now, during this forum, we will listen to the ILO presentation on social dialogue. We'll also listen to the prominent speakers to share their perspectives on social dialogue as a tool to enhance the conditions of work and, of course, the terms of employment for teachers, and other education employees. We'll also have the opportunity to share the EI Africa as proposed framework for social dialogue in order to get additional inputs and validate the framework. Also, feel free to make your inputs via the chat box and also make use of the question and answer session. All right, and now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the following speakers we have for you today. Our first speaker is Dr. Dennis Sinyolo, the Regional Director for EI Africa. We also have Mr. Ahambani Mashelani, the Director of AUC, and as well as Dr. Quinton Wooden, the Director of UNESCO IICPA, and Raina Prickster, who is a Senior Specialist for Social Dialogue at ILO. All right, we also have panelists who will be sharing country and partner perspectives on social dialogues. And the panelists also include Dr. Vargas, Dr. Carlos Vargas, who is the head of Secretariat of the International Task Force on Teachers and Education 2030. We also then have Professor Steve Nochikoya, the Director of Africa Federation of Teaching. And my apologies if I did pronounce any of your names incorrectly. We also then have Mrs. Mariam Chipko, who is from the SNEN Niger, as well as Philbert Bates Faguma he is the General Secretary from the Uganda National Teachers Union in Uganda. All right, now this webinar will start with some opening remarks who will be conducted by the Director of UNESCO, as well as Dr. Dennis Sinyolo, who will explain what has motivated EI Africa to draft a framework for social dialogue and what the main purpose of this forum will be. I'm going to start over with Mr. Dr. Dennis Sinyolo, and he'll give us his 5 minutes of the opening remarks for this session. It's over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Mbali. Good morning, colleagues, and good afternoon for some of us, because I know it's already afternoon. Welcome once again to this very important joint online forum on social dialogue. As Mbali has already indicated, we are privileged as Education International Africa Region to be co-hosting this very important event with UNESCO's International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, UNESCO ICPA, the African Union Commission. Director Mashelena, I believe you're already with us. We appreciate you very much. The International Labour Organization and the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. I've seen Carlos already online, and I believe that Raina is also online with us from the ILO, and certainly my colleague Quentin from UNESCO ICPA. So thank you so much for attending this webinar, but also thanks to all the co-hosts for joining hands with Education International Africa Region to organize it. Ladies and gentlemen, social dialogue or continuous engagement between workers' organizations and employers or employers' organizations is crucial for ensuring industrial harmony, decent salaries, and working conditions. In the education sector, social dialogue helps create harmonious and conducive conditions for teaching and learning. This is because teachers' working conditions are children's learning conditions. Colleagues, governments play a dual role, that of regulator and that of employer. They employ public sector workers, including teachers and education support personnel. As regulator, the government should guarantee social dialogue, including collective bargaining, through policy and legislation. National legislation should be in line with international labor standards as defined by the ILO. Unfortunately, research evidence shows that in far too many countries, we see governments provide relatively favorable labor legislation to protect the rights of workers in the private sector, but restrictive legislation to govern its own workers in the public sector. This cuts across many African countries where we have a dual approach, favorable working conditions for the private sector, regulated by government, the regulator, less favorable for public sector workers, regulated by the regulator who is also employer. So there is a problem. So that's why as Education International, we call for the same labor legislation for both the private sector and the public sector. We call specifically for institutionalized, genuine and continuous dialogue between the employers and workers. Governments as employers should lead by example by creating and implementing a robust social dialogue framework. Education International Africa region developed and adopted a social dialogue framework in 2022. The framework is a guide to support countries to develop or strengthen their social dialogue frameworks. We have seen progress in countries like Uganda and Zambia, for example, where the government has developed a framework for social dialogue, working closely with the teachers' unions. It may not be perfect, but at least it's a good start. Effective social dialogue frameworks should be developed with the full involvement of educators and their unions. As already stated by Mbali at the beginning, the purpose of this online forum, colleagues, is to present, discuss, strengthen and validate the EI Africa Social Dialogue Framework. But we also want to learn from your own experiences on what works in terms of social dialogue. The document that will emerge from this forum will be handed over to the African Union Commission so that they can adapt it and appropriate it as an official document of the African Union. We believe our collective effort will help develop a strong social dialogue framework in Africa. If such a robust framework is fully implemented, it will help improve teacher motivation, teaching and learning in our classrooms across the continent for the benefit of all. Let me just end by saying this. Teachers want to do what they know how to do best to teach, but quite often they're concerned about the poor working conditions, the meager salaries, where the next meal will come from. Social dialogue can help address these issues, can help improve the teaching and learning environment, as I've said. So what we're doing today is fundamental. It can be a game changer for our continent in the years to come. Thank you once again for joining this very important webinar. We appreciate you. We value your inputs. We know that we'll emerge from this with a stronger document. We're stronger together. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Regional Director. We'll now listen to the opening remarks from Hambelani Masheleni, who is the Director of AUC. Hambani, sorry, are you here with us?
Yes, Tetani, I'm here with you.
All right, it's over to you. You only have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Because I've got 5 minutes, I will observe all the protocols, but I would like really to underscore the work that Education International and IGBA have put in front of us today. This is very important. When I was growing up, I had an opportunity to decide what I wanted to be when I was in class with the teachers. I would say when I grow up, I would like to be a teacher, a doctor, a policeman, and all this inspiration was coming because of the teachers. And therefore, our meeting today, it's really a milestone and a defining moment that can be, like already been said, be a game changer and a transformation towards better recognition, better professional recognition of the teaching profession. Teachers are very critical. We have our own ambitions as a continent through Agenda 2063. 80% of its objectives can only be accomplished by high caliber African citizens that are educated in various areas: doctors, nurses, teachers, agriculturists, pilots, you mention all. And all this to happen, it will be because of teachers. But teachers are like all of us. They need to be recognized in one way or another and incentivized, and to make sure that the teaching profession, it's really a professional teaching profession that we want to see delivering on our agenda. I read one report by UIS, UNESCO report, which was looking at the gap that Africa has of teachers. And it says it's 17 million. But is it true that Africa doesn't have teachers? Doesn't it mean that teachers are leaving the teaching profession because we are not doing enough for the teaching profession? And therefore, this gathering here today is very critical for us, all of us, including the African Union. We have got a continental agenda for education, CESA 16 to 2025. We've got the SDG 4. These global agendas underline the need for teacher development. Teacher development. We have all the 55 countries of Africa coming together in various forms, be it the STC on education, science, technology, and innovation. Talking about education, at the center are teachers. We went through a process of the global transforming education through UNESCO last year and ended up in New York, and we adopted a declaration on transforming education. Teachers are at the center of that declaration. We also, at the level of the African Union, brought together heads of state and government during that same meeting in New York, together with the heads of other international organizations, to talk about transforming education in Africa so that Africa doesn't remain behind. And one of the things that we also underlined was teacher development. But all this to happen, we have to pay special attention to all the facets and dimensions of teachers and teaching profession. We are very lucky. 2024 has been designated as the year of education by the heads of state and Africa of the African Union. This is a huge opportunity for us to speak about teacher development and teaching profession. In that case, we are developing a concept note and a roadmap to present to the heads of state and government so that we start to implement the commitments we make in education. And the first objective of our roadmap is to encourage the teaching profession reform through comprehensive quality teacher development programs. And here we want to first look at what has already been developed as the instruments that are on the ground to foster teaching profession and teacher development. Number two, we want to develop new policies, new frameworks that encourage the teacher development and teaching profession. And here, this is one of the most important ones we are having today as our meeting. And I would like to urge the meeting to take into consideration the roadmap and propose a standalone action area for the effective social dialogue that promotes the teaching profession on the continent within the roadmap of the AU that we will launch for the theme of the year come 2024. With this, I would like once again to thank all of you for coming here, for putting all our comparative advantages, capacities, and the thoughts to ensure that we go beyond just developing teachers, but making the teaching profession a profession of choice. When I grow up, I would like to be a teacher. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masheleni. We'll now then ask Dr. Quinton Wooden, the Director of UNESCO IICPA, for his opening remarks. Dr. Wooden, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. And if I may, I will share my screen. Is that feasible, Henok? I think so, right? So let me try to do this. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I hope that you can see my screen. Can you see it? No,
Yes,
we can.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will stand on protocol as Dr. Mash has done. And when Denis proposed this webinar at ICBA, we were very enthusiastic about it. We believe that social dialogues are extremely important. And if I have 5 minutes, I would like to share with you 2 simple ideas. The first one will take just 10 seconds. If you look at the wealth of countries, what we call the challenging wealth of nations, people, that is human capital, represents 2/3 of the wealth of countries, the assets that countries have to promote development. And education is by far the most important component of human capital wealth. Education is extremely important, and teachers are the key to end the learning crisis in Africa. That's one idea. But the second idea is that I think that we need to do a much better job at understanding the issues that teachers face. How are they satisfied or not? And this is the second idea that I would like to spend 4 minutes on. So if you look at the framework that help us think about teacher policies, one of them was a framework which was called SABER, created about 10 years ago at the World Bank. You see that one of the keys is to motivate teachers to perform. And in that diagram on the right, that objective was the number 8, but it actually matters for everybody. I hope that.
Sorry, Quentin,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. We're only seeing the first slide, so I think.
All right. So what I'm going to do, yes, I'm going just to talk, and we will share the slides afterwards. That might be a bit easier.
Okay.
So the frameworks that look at teacher policies emphasize teacher motivation, which depends on satisfaction, right? So, but do we know what affects the satisfaction of the teachers? Do we know what they are happy about and what they are not happy about? One of my colleagues, Hungi Njora, did recent work in Kenya. And what you see in Kenya, but I think you see it when you do those surveys in many different countries, is that the first reason for burnout and lack of satisfaction among the teachers is the issue of a lack of a career progression, the lack of perspective, as well as often an issue of low wages. So we have to deal with wages and with the career prospects of teachers. Now, that is not necessarily easy because there may be a budget cost, right? But what is also important is that other factors affect teacher satisfaction. And one of those factors is the quality of the school leadership and whether teachers feel valued in their work. Way too often, this is not the case. Now, when you try to understand the various factors that affect teacher motivation, apart from the issue of the living wages and the career prospects, you have those issues of lack of validation as well as often poor mental health, burnout, and so on. And some of the work that my colleague Pungi did show in a very nice way that if you have mechanisms in schools that can promote the well-being of teachers, what we broadly call mechanisms related to mental health and psychosocial support, teachers are going to be more motivated. And what you see is that when the teachers are motivated, that reduces absenteeism, that increases the quality of the teaching that they do. And actually it increases, you can show it, it increases the level of learning in the classroom. And so the second idea that I wanted to share is twofold. So one, we need to implement those job satisfaction surveys to inform the social dialogues that would happen at the country level. And we need to make sure that apart from ensuring that teachers have a decent wage, don't have to work 3 jobs in order to survive, we also need to strengthen a wide range of mechanisms at the school level that can help them. So I don't want to take too much time. So let me essentially stop here. We believe this is a fundamental topic. We believe there is a role for much more thorough analysis that can then inform the policies and practices that governments, and as it is said also in the private sector, can be implemented to make sure that the teachers are motivated, satisfied, because that's one of the key ingredients to improve learning and end the learning crisis. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wooden. We will now then ask for the opening remarks by the lead persons of AUC, UNESCO, IICBA, and EI Africa. And of course, we will now then head over to Reina Pritzer. She's the senior specialist in the IOL's special social dialogue and tripartisan branch, and ILO will give us their presentation in terms of what their take is when it comes to social dialogue. It's over to you, Reina. Is Reina with us? All right, I think Reina is not with us. I think then we can just move on to our next segment, and where this section of this panel discussion, we will then ask our panelists to come on board. They will talk on the social dialogue perspectives. The panelists include, in no particular order, Mrs. Mariama Chipko, the former General Secretary of Syndicate, or rather SNEN, and Vice Chairperson of EI Africa Regional Committee. We also have Professor Steve Nokwecha, who is a part of the Director of the Africa Federation of Teaching Regulatory Authorities. We also have Philbert Bates Baguma, who is the General Secretary of Uganda National Teachers Union, and Dr. Carlos Vargos, who will then also be part of our panel. For this segment of this panel, we will only then ask this one question for all the people I've just outlined and presented to you. And the question is here: what is your perspective on social dialogue and why is it paramount? Mrs. Mariama, will start with you. The question again, I'll read it to you. What is your perspective on social dialogue and why is it paramount?
Bien, merci, madame, pour l'expérience du Niger que je voudrais partager ici. Le syndicat national des enseignants du Niger que je représente a un comité national de négociation avec le gouvernement. Ce comité tient des rencontres régulières chaque année à l'occasion, avant les affectations des enseignants. Il est impliqué au sein de cette commission-là pour s'assurer que ces affectations-là se font dans le respect des enseignants et de leur famille. Ce comité, je tiens à le dire, par exemple, le 9 juin passé seulement, a été reçu par le président de la République, effectivement, dans le cadre de la transformation des systèmes éducatifs dans lequel notre pays est engagé. Mon syndicat, à travers ce comité, a obtenu cette rencontre du président de la République pour discuter avec lui en termes de priorité, c'est la professionnalisation de l'enseignement, parce que nous sommes dans un pays où la majorité, plus de 70% des enseignants sont des contractuels. Et quand on veut parler de la transformation de l'éducation, quand on veut aller vers une éducation de qualité, impérativement, il faut professionnaliser ces enseignants. Il faut passer du statut de contractuel au statut d'enseignant permanent. Et nous avons reçu cet engagement-là de principe du président de la République d'aller progressivement dans le cadre de la professionnalisation de l'enseignement. C'est notre priorité. On professionnalise les enseignants et à l'avenir aussi, on crée les conditions pour leur assurer le minimum de conditions de vie et de travail. Les conditions de vie des enseignants, c'est l'amélioration naturellement de leur salaire, le salaire et tous les avantages qui sont autour. Nous avons posé la question de paiement des incidences liées au reclassement des enseignants. Il y a des arriérés, ça fait des années que ça ne se passe pas, ce n'est pas régulier et le président a donné des instructions pour que cela soit avec le ministère en charge de l'éducation, le ministre des Finances. Donc voici en termes de priorité, ce sur quoi notre syndicat est en train d'aller. C'est-à-dire que nous sommes d'accord qu'il faut aller vers la transformation de l'éducation et l'enseignant est au centre, il est au cœur de cette transformation et tout ce que nous allons faire à l'avenir et que nous sommes en train de faire avec les autorités, c'est de leur montrer et qu'ils soient convaincus avec nous qu'il faudrait que ces enseignants soient non seulement des professionnels, qu'on assure leur formation continue de qualité et que nous sommes d'accord, même au niveau du profil d'entrée des enseignants, qu'on doit revoir à la hausse ce profil d'entrée tout en créant les conditions aussi que leur salaire leur permette quand même de vivre non seulement décemment, mais aussi de faire correctement leur travail. Voici de façon succincte l'expérience que nous pouvons partager au niveau du dialogue social qui est en train de payer quand même, puisque au-delà des ministères sectoriels, c'est le président de la République, on arrive à dialoguer, à discuter directement avec le président de la République en tant que syndicat des enseignants. Je vous remercie.
All right, thank you very much, Mrs. Mariama, for your perspective. We'll now then head over to Professor Steve Nwokiocha. Professor Steve, you have at least 7 minutes to just give us your perspective when it comes to social dialogue and why it is paramount.
Thank you, colleagues. My name is Steve Nwokiocha, as you heard, Executive Director, Africa Federation of Teaching Regulatory Authorities. AFTRA for short. AFTRA is the Intergovernmental Federation in Africa, comprising ministries of education and national teaching councils for regulating teaching in the 55 countries. As the name implies, AFTRA is fundamentally interested in the working conditions, not just the professionalization of teachers. Therefore, this social dialogue framework and ongoing discussions are core to the work that AFTRA is doing. And let us go back memory lane to underscore the need for this social dialogue, particularly the framework. There has been this landmark study by African Union in 2017 that is called the Study on the Training, the Working and Living Conditions of Teachers. It was a continental study that showed that the training, the working, and the living condition of teachers are deplorable when compared with other regions of the world. And therefore, that kickstarted a lot of frameworks. And I'm happy that Social Dialogue has joined the pack or harvest of such frameworks. It was at the behest of the AU study that we have so many frameworks, such as the Teaching Standards Framework, Teacher Qualification Framework, Teacher Mobility Framework, and so forth, up to Africa Continental Qualification Framework. And now we are having the dialogue, Social Dialogue Framework. These frameworks are important because they provide opportunity for all parties involved in education and involved in managing the teaching force to use consensus to understand the problems and the best alternatives. I can tell you that without frameworks, not much could be achieved, because recently I worked to UNESCO IGBA in Scientific study in West Africa, and we have had such studies in 2017 on behalf of International Task Force. You find out that countries that lag behind in several respects in the teaching force are those countries that are unaware of global or international frameworks. Not that they are not interested in doing anything. In fact, many of them have wasted enormous resources developing their local frameworks. But when they come in contact with the international frameworks, they now discover that they are not aligned, and a lot of energy has been wasted, and they have to redo it. So a social dialogue framework and ongoing social dialogue is critically necessary to energize the member states and to point the way forward. And that will be, what will complement the work we do. In AFTRA, the key word is professionalization. We want teachers to be professionals, because it is said that teaching is the mother of all professions. How come it's the least in choice, ranking below other professions? And so we felt that it is critical to put in all those tenets of professionalism, teaching standards, licensing, registration, and discipline, as well as even up to school leadership, professionalized, even up to education officers in the ministries and agencies, professionalized, those who manage and control teaching force, professionalized, so that teaching will have the character of medicine, law, and so forth. And by so doing, there is implication that when you make teachers professionals, their condition of service must change. Because we find out that when you say teachers must be professionalized, you're raising the bar, you're increasing the standards, you're making them to work more, to do more, to study more. And then the condition of service has to be complementary, because these things cannot stand alone. And therefore, social dialogue is very imperative to address some of these fundamental issues that has been identified by the AU study since 2017, of which we have been working assiduously to address. You look at the earning of teachers, it's among the poorest, except where it has been professionalized, and some professional allowances are introduced for people who are registered and licensed, and for people working in hard areas or in special subjects. If you're a medical doctor, when you're on call, you get allowances because you're a professional. You're not just a civil servant. When you have a case of misconduct against you, you have your fellow professionals on the disciplinary committee. You won't be put out there by civil servants to try you. So even in matters of disciplinary measures, we want all aspects of these conditions addressed, looking at teachers as professionals. Where do teachers work? I'm happy with what Dr. Dennis has said, and that is the catchphrase. The working condition of the teachers is the learning condition and environment of the students. What is the kind of physical working condition of the teachers? Do they have even minimal facilities and infrastructure such as staff rooms, toilets, drinking water, wash hands, and all sorts? What about instructional resources as professionals? You won't have medical doctors and you put them in the theater without operating beds and operating equipment. But you have teachers teaching with bare fingers, and of course, having no library or resources or connection to internet. After post-COVID, or now we are in post-COVID, we are talking about digital and remote teaching and learning. So obviously, in conclusion, social dialogue is extremely important to bring together this new wave of frameworks, new wave of perspectives that have been given rise to by the EU study and which has become a global reality. And for most teaching regulatory authorities in Africa, they're regulating both public and private sector because Dennis raised those issues as well. So we are interested to see how these things play out for both public and private teachers, because all of these teachers, whether public or private, they are teaching the citizens of Africa. They are teaching the citizens of their country. So social dialogue is inevitable and the frameworks are highly welcome, but most importantly, they should reach the grassroots, because we found out that those countries that have no idea of these frameworks did nothing about them, and they are moving in the wrong direction, not out of their will, but because they had no information. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Steve, for your insights. We'll now head on over to Mr. Philbert Bates Baguma for him to give us his perspective. Mr. Baguma, it's over to you. Mr. Baguma, are you with us? Okay, let's head on over to Dr. Carlos while we try to track down Mr. Baguma. Dr. Carlos, could you please give us your perspective on social dialogue and the importance of it and why it's so paramount?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much, Mbali, for the question. Very happy to participate hand in hand with EI, with our colleagues in ICBA and the African Union Commission. Indeed, I would like to probably share with you some of the key. You asked about why social dialogue is paramount, and I think I'll start by saying, at least because of three key functions of social dialogue. One of them has to do with the fact that social dialogue is a key element in achieving decent work for men and women. In this case, it has to do with decent work for our teachers and education personnel, which I will not abound on the importance of these working conditions and the impact that they have on quality education, on their engagement, on teacher motivation, and other elements that have been mentioned before. So to begin with, I think the issue of decent work, and probably my colleague from the ILO will abound on that, is an important key. Now, the second one has to do with the fact that social dialogue actually improves precisely this: conversation and dialogue and conflict resolution among matters that are important, that have to do with working conditions, but not only. It also has to do with negotiating our views, our ideas as to the quality of education, the purpose of education, and actually the policy solutions and the decisions that are made to improve the quality of teaching and learning, and where teachers should have a voice, but they don't often do. And this is the third point, and why I think it is very important to foster social dialogue. It has to do with the very democratization of education. So, of course, it gives voice to teachers regarding education. So, as we said before, not only working conditions, we know social dialogue is very important for collective bargaining, for the material, the contractual, the remuneration of teachers, which is of absolute importance, but also that teachers, from the knowledge that they produce in the classroom, from the proximity that they have with the needs of learners, of communities, of families, are very well placed to make educational decisions. From the classroom and onwards, the very training, the very trade, the very profession of teaching has to do with making pedagogical decisions at the classroom level. But often enough, this doesn't happen because there is no promotion of teacher voice, there is no involvement, there's no invitation for teachers to be at the decision-making table. So sometimes their professional autonomy is curtailed by accountability regimes that tell teachers what to do, when to do it, how to do it. They're inspected, they're evaluated so that they do it. So this removes a lot of creativity, a lot of autonomy, a lot of innovation potential of teacher work. And that has to do also with working conditions. So you see, it's not only the material conditions of teaching, but actually the symbolic conditions of teaching. And within the symbolic conditions, the status of the profession is very important. And this presupposes that we have a social construction of teachers, not only as implementers of whatever is decided by experts and others, but actually as knowledge producers, as reflective practitioners, and as policy partners. This is something that you have seen has been posited by UNESCO's recent report on reimagining our futures together and a social contract for education, where teachers are actually central. Now, it is important to mention that there are two normative instruments, the only two normative instruments that are global and that refer to teachers, their rights, their responsibilities. And I would like to make just a reference to the 1966 ILO UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of teachers and the 1997 UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel. As you know, these documents encapsulate the rights, the responsibilities of teachers. They are based on education as a human right. It has foundational principles, including the rights of teachers to engage in social dialogue. So just to mention a few of the articles in the 1966 recommendation, for example, Article 9 of the guiding principles recognizes teacher organizations as the force that can contribute to educational advance and which therefore should be associated with the determination of educational policy. So that is important. Teachers, their unions, their organizations, national teaching councils, service commissions have a right, as stipulated by the 1966 recommendation, to participate in education policy. And from the side of policymakers and other actors, it is in the best interest, actually, of the policy process, as we have seen, and we can speak of a number of examples that we have supported from UNESCO and the Teacher Task Force to develop policy in this very way, in which teachers are engaged. We were last week in Zambia collaborating with EI precisely on the development of a teacher policy with the participation of teacher organizations. Now, the 1966 recommendation also posits that there should be close cooperation between the competent authorities, the organizations of teachers, employers, workers, but also parents, cultural organizations, institutions of learning and research, etc. So I would say it is very important to consider that for social dialogue to thrive, and this is the third function that I was referring to, it has to do with democratizing educational decision making. So one huge role to play is by teachers, by their teacher unions, their organizations, but also opening the stage and inviting to the table other organizations such as non-governmental, parental associations, learner associations, and so on. So finally, just to wrap up, Umbali, just to say, it is very important that the negotiations are not only about salaries. They're not only about the working conditions. The negotiations are also about the purpose of education, of the kind of education we want to see, coming out of the Transforming Education Summit, and the role that teachers can and actually do play in this transformation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Carlos. That is Dr. Carlos Vargas from UNESCO. Of course, we'll try Mr. Philbert Bates Baguma again. Mr. Baguma, are you with us? Mr. Baguma? Okay, maybe we can try Mr. Baguma once more a bit later on. But for now, earlier on, we had opening remarks by lead persons from AUC, from UNESCO, IICBA, and from EI Africa. We'll now try Reina Pritzel once again, who's the senior specialist at ILO's Social Dialogue and Tripartisan Branch. Reina, are you with us? Can you give us your opening remarks for today's session?
Yes, Thank you very much. I'm here. I was here before. I could hear all of you. Somehow I did not have the right to also speak. I'm grateful for this. I'm here. I also have a small presentation to share with you. I don't know if you want me to do that or if you want to bring it up at your end. It is very short, but it may help to just follow the speech. What do you suggest?
You can
Please.
bring up your presentation.
Okay. I have to go into mine here. There we go. It's just 4 slides. Can you see it?
Yes, all is clear. We can see you quite well.
Wonderful. I just leave it there before we lose more time. Time is of the essence.
Yes, don't worry. You have 10 minutes. Use it wisely.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm standing in for my colleague, Oliver Liang. Maybe some of you know him. He had a last-minute impediment yesterday when he contacted me and said, can you please jump in and talk about the social dialogue in education, what he would have liked to do. So I'm maybe now more on the social dialogue. Generally speaking, not so much focusing on public sector, private sector, educational sector, but I think we'll still get around. I have heard 3 panelists already, which helped me to understand where you are, where some of the issues are, and I can perhaps from there also add to my presentation. First of all, when we talk about social dialogue, we may have different things in mind. The ones believe it is this, the others believe it is that, and there's a wide school of many scholars who also have their own interpretation and definition of social dialogue. We at the ILO, we practice social dialogue since our inception, since day one of our creation, of the creation of our organization, which is more than 100 years ago, 104 years to be precise. We have governments in our governing bodies and all decision-taking institutions, but not only governments like the rest of the UN system. We are unique in also having representatives of the workers and the employers in our bodies, in practically everything we do on a more or less almost daily basis. We work in a tripartite fashion throughout all steps in the organization, be it on program and budget, be it on discussing the finances, be it on technical cooperation issues and what you have. So we do social dialogue, and we believe we have the right also to come up with our own definition. I have put it out here. You will get the PowerPoint afterwards. So just to put everybody at the same level and also to explain a little bit what we are talking about. Social dialogue has several elements. It means, first of all types of negotiation or consultation or information sharing. And that among the representatives of governments, employers, and workers, if all 3 come together, we talk about tripartite dialogue. Or if it is between the employers and the workers, then it is bipartite dialogue. And on what? On issues of common interest relating to economic and social policy. This is a wide definition, much falls under it. And I break it quickly down for you. You see the triangle on the right side that shows the intensity of the dialogue. The first level, the first step, if you want to wish, is the exchange of information, is the information sharing. That is practically without any obligations. The partners, 2 or 3 and more, come together, exchange information. That serves very much for trust building. And we are all coming back to, I will come back to the trust building. We all know how difficult it is to have trust in negotiations. Why? Because perhaps often we don't go step 1, step 2, step 3. we jump to negotiations one time, which is at the top of this pyramid. But after exchanging information, sharing information, is the level of consultation, when the same partners around the table come together, have shared their information, and then they say, what do you think? How do you see that? What is your reaction? This is consultation, the consultation level of social dialogue. And that is very often the stage when policy making is concerned. So policy making with the governments, but it can also be policy making at a larger enterprise, for instance. And you see, this is step one. We are now at step two, and only at the last step comes the level of negotiations. This is very intensive, and everybody who has participated in negotiations knows how stressful it is. And we have made so much experience in our work life that negotiations must be stressful if you skip step one and step two, if you jump into negotiations one time. There's no information that you know about, or not much that you know about each other, no trust that has been built over time. Here we are coming together and much is at stake. Hence it is very stressful. If you go through all three stages, negotiations can become much smoother. I'm not saying it is an easy game. Negotiations will always be a little stressful because things are at stake. But if you go through the first two stages, much of the stress will be taken out from the negotiation proper. So these are the three levels of social dialogue. Any consultation is already social dialogue. Any exchange of information on economic, social policy issues of common interest, even at the enterprise level, is social dialogue, ladies and gentlemen. So we can easily abort social dialogue very successfully and positively, and build trust accordingly. Secondly, I spoke about tripartite or bipartite dialogue. Here in this context, obviously we have, I have to distinguish. We have to a large extent the public service, where actually government may be the employer. Then it is between the employers. Government acts as an employer. It is between the employers and the workers, the teachers or the teachers' unions representing the teachers. Then we are at the level of bipartite dialogue. However, if we want to talk about policies, then we have tripartite dialogue. The teachers' unions are invited to government tables, consultations on new policies, policy measures, laws that affect the world of work, that affect teachers, but also the employers. And if not the government itself is the employer, here the private learning institutions can also come in as employers. And then we are at the tripartite level. Very important, just for our own understanding, to remember tripartite, bipartite, who is involved. Government can act as an employer, and then we only have two parties. Issues of common interest, well, we have to agree on what we talk. Hence, do we all adopt the agenda and pass on? And it should be related to economic and social policy issues, otherwise it would not be social dialogue. But hence, economic and social policy is a wide field. Anything that relates to the world of work falls under here. In some countries, in some institutions, even social dialogue is practiced around the national budget, because in the end, even the national budget has an impact on the world of work. How much is given in a certain sector, be it transport sector, be it also education sector, and so on. So it is a wide field, but we don't just talk about the sun and but even the greening and the global warming does have a major impact on the world of work, and also on maybe the curricula the teaching curricula. So even that can fall under social dialogue, the topics to be discussed. That was a quick one on this important stage setting. I perhaps can go a little faster on some preconditions. What do we need for social dialogue to work? And on what do we then work? Quickly, first, we have identified 4 preconditions for effective social dialogue, not just social dialogue, we come together and talk. We have to have an enabling legal environment. Freedom of association has to be there. Collective bargaining has to be allowed. Mutual respect for the parties is also important. We have to have social partners who are free and strong and independent and representative. Strong, I mean also strong on their topics. If we talk about teachers, trade unions, be strong on the topics you want to negotiate about. So you have to do a lot of homework before. It is not just numbers, figures, salaries, but the whole economic environment in which you move. Thirdly, we need to have political will and commitment by all actors for effective social dialogue. Anybody who does not want to have effective social dialogue obviously can boycott it, and we will not have effective social dialogue. And finally, also we need some institutional support, be it financial support, be it administrative support, to hold social dialogue. Social dialogue, which is more than negotiations, it is also the exchange and the consultation phase, we remember. And some topical issues we have found out in education, you know better than I do. Maybe I can skip those, you can look at it, you may raise it in your further presentations or questions around policies, but also around collective bargaining. It should be interest-based, not positional, but interest-based. We all can reach win-win situations. And the bargaining mandate. It should be more than just talking about salaries. I heard it just before from our colleague from UNESCO. Definitely, negotiations is more than just talking about salaries. And often that is the only topic on the table. But you can talk about continued training. You can talk about transport issues, how to get to this learning institution or back. You can talk about uniforms. You can talk about related loans for computers, for instance, and so on. There's many more topics here. My last slide, very quickly. I want to refer to some important standards. On the left side, we see the ILO conventions that are important in this context. I will not go through them now. The 2 first ones are more fundamental. The tripartite consultation is still a priority convention, and then we have more than 160 technical conventions. Some I noted here, and on the right side is other instruments. Our colleague from UNESCO already raised the 2 recommendations. We have also ILO policy guidelines, and we also have supervisory mechanisms at the ILO to supervise the application of the conventions, and also a joint ILO-UNESCO committee of experts to supervise the application of these 2 recommendations. So far, my presentation. Thank you very much for giving me 2 more minutes, and I'm going to stay with you.
Okay, then thank you very much. Of course, that is Rainer Pritzer, who is the senior specialist in the IOL's social dialogue and tripartisan branch. Of course, you can still make use of our box below, the chat box below, if you'd like to ask him any questions. But earlier on, we also had 3 people from our panelists who were indeed speaking about social dialogue and their perspective, giving us their perspective on why it is so important. It is now time for you, our participants, to ask questions to Mrs. Mariama Chipkau and Professor Steve, as well as Dr. Carlos Vargas on their inputs in which they shared with us a bit earlier on. You can ask the question through our chat box or through our Q&A section, or you can just come onto the platform and be very direct in terms of where your question is going to, who your question is directed to, and ask your questions clearly. So over to you, participants.
Maybe we can ask Rainer to stop sharing his screen as well, so we can see the participants. Thank you, Rainer.
Yes, I try to. Oh, here I am. Thank you. I found it.
Okay, for now, I don't see any questions from our participants.
I think that they may
Bali,
not be
there are several hands that are up. I see Roger Kafo.
Oh, yes. Roger, it's over to you.
Oui, bonjour à tout le monde. Je suis Roger Kafo de la Fédération des syndicats de l'enseignement et de la recherche du Cameroun. Je voudrais remercier tous les intervenants qui ont fait des présentations exceptionnelles. Et je voudrais insister sur la présentation de Carlos de l'UNESCO, qui a insisté sur le côté symbolique des conditions de travail de l'enseignant. Et ma question, c'est par rapport au dernier intervenant qui a présenté les trois étapes du dialogue. Généralement, dans nos pays, la dernière étape, on ne l'atteint jamais. Je vais parler du cas du Cameroun que je connais bien. Depuis 30 ans que je suis dans l'action syndicale au Cameroun, nous n'avons jamais atteint la troisième étape qui est celle des négociations. Alors, est-ce que je peux considérer qu'on fait quand même du dialogue social, même si de temps en temps on échange des informations, de temps en temps on nous consulte et on ne tient même pas souvent compte de ce que nous disons. Merci.
All right, thank you very much. That is Roger there posing some of his questions to our speakers. Who'd like to respond? Carlos, will you like to respond on the sentiments shared by Roger?
Yeah, certainly. I think the issue of the symbolic dimension, the material dimension we know very well. Rainer made a reference to it, and our colleagues have today spoken about the working conditions of teachers, the issue of contract teachers, the issue of decent work, workloads that have been multiplied after the pandemic and so on, which are very important. But maybe regarding the symbolic, I think it is very important to underline, on the one hand, the respect and the trust that we have in teachers. That presupposes, the actual invitation, the actual consultation, the actual kind of exchanges, to use the triangle that Rainer was presenting, and negotiations that we may have. If we consider teachers as equals, as interlocutors in the policy process, I like the issue of social dialogue, without being a reiteration. A is social, it's collective. And second is dialogical. And dialogue, in the words of Paulo Freire, presupposes that we are at the same position and that we respect and we listen to one another. So now, that position can only be conveyed and conferred when trust in teachers has been granted. If we do not trust teachers, their knowledge, their contributions to education, then we might not be able to engage in social dialogue as equals. And following up on the second part of Roger's question, and this is probably why sometimes after the social dialogue, after the listening to voices, after the consultations with teachers, they are not taken up. You see, the voices are there, there is expression, but there's no impact into what happens in terms of policy making. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Carlos. We've also got another hand from Arbro Borge. Would you like to pose your question?
Hello?
Abraham. Yeah.
Hello?
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, my name is Abraham from Cape Verde. I'm General Secretary of Cape Verde Federation of Teachers. Just to congratulate you with the last presentations about social dialogue. To see, and I want to know what should we do for more fruitful social dialogue in our country, for example. For example, Cape Verde has had a dialogue, negotiation with the Minister of Education, but if it even is sometime except the time to put in practice, you know, that's it. That's my questions. How we can do for make more fruitful our social dialogue in Cape Verde, in our country, you know, because, for example, the student teachers pass a long time without promoting in their career. Tell us how we can do. Thank you very much.
Yes, and your question is directed to Reina.
Yes, the last presentation about the social dialogue, yes.
All right, Reina, can you please come on the platform and respond?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. This is not the first time we are hearing this question. It unfortunately comes too often. And there's not one panacea that I can give, which will then answer all questions in every given situation. But what I can say is, we have to see what is missing. What is the missing element for having the social dialogue the way you expect, and also how I explained it. And there perhaps, if we go back to my third slide, don't have to do it now, where I talk about the preconditions for effective social dialogue. It was 4 elements. And all 4 of these elements have to be in place in order to get social dialogue working. If one is missing, we don't have it. So first of all, we have to see, are all these elements in place? Do we have the legal environment? Do we have the respect for each other? Secondly, do we have strong social partners, independent representative, and so on? Yes, if that is not the case, maybe we have to work on that point. Is there political will and commitment? If that is not the case, well, that is then the area we have to tackle. And so it may be different in different circumstances. I don't know the situation of Cape Verde myself, and also not in the education sector, but we do have an office, an ILO office around in Senegal, close by in Senegal, who you may contact with exactly that same question. And if there's anything that the local office in Senegal can help, they cover also your country of Cape Verde from there. They may know, the colleagues there may know the situation on the ground better. And this is part of what we want to do. And you do discuss with the Ministry of Education, that is normal. We, from our end, try to also, we discuss from our end with the Ministry of Labor, usually, and we try to also bring in other ministries who do discuss with Ministry of Labor. They know a little more about social dialogue. So if you can bring them together, either suggest to the Ministry of Education, why not social dialogue? Labor Ministry can come in, or through the union side. I heard you are from the union side. You may also contact the ILO directly and see what they can help you right there on the ground, because every situation is different from country to country. But there are ways to help you.
Sorry, Mbali, if I may jump just to with the one additional point, which is, as you may know, there's a standing committee, joint ILO UNESCO committee of experts on the application, on the recommendations on the status of teachers. It's called the CERT. It's an acronym. Now, the CERT is jointly run by UNESCO and the ILO, and it actually hears allegations. There's an allegations mechanism for where recommendations are not being respected or fulfilled. So just to say, there is the possibility of submitting an allegation as well for the review of the committee, and the committee meets every 3 years, next meeting will be in Geneva at the ILO in 2024. So just to say, please do look at the mechanism for allegations. That is something that can be put to the consideration of the CERC. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Of course, we'll now then move on. I saw that there is another hand which is up. But Jacques, could you please keep your question in check? We will then catch up with you a bit later on, should we have another Q&A session. Of course, moving on to our next segment, the main focus of this forum is for EI Africa Framework for Social Dialogue, as we've heard from our various speakers from today. We'll now listen to Dr. Perry Anwi, the regional coordinator for EI Africa, who also then summarize the framework. Then participants can come up with comments and inputs aimed at improving the framework. It is my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Perry Anwi to present the EI Africa Framework for Social Dialogue. Perry, you have about 10 minutes to present the framework. Thank you. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Mbali. Trying to share my screen or taking some time. Well, while I'm checking to share it, I can just start because my time is very short. Well, the EI Africa Framework for Social Dialogue is premised on EI's conviction that a genuine social dialogue is crucial for the successful development and implementation of quality education policies, and is also premised on EI's aim to achieve improvement of the welfare and the status of teachers and other education employees through effective promotion and application of their human and trade union rights and professional freedoms, of course, as stated in the 1966 ILO UNESCO recommendation. So this framework seeks to inform the development of national frameworks for social dialogue and encourage the creation of a conducive climate for industrial relations, policy and social dialogue, including collective bargaining, with the ultimate goal, and I repeat that, with the ultimate goal of improving quality education and also harmonizing industrial relations. Well, the social dialogue framework has two major parts. One, a preamble, and then fundamental principles. Well, for the preamble, this is just to inform you that the framework does not come ex nihilo. It takes into consideration existing frameworks, existing instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, especially in its articles 20 and 23, and also taking into consideration the ILO instruments, namely the Convention 87 on the freedom of association and protection of the rights and to organize, the Convention 98 on the right to organize and collective bargaining, and the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and the 2008 ILO Declaration on Social Justice for Fair Globalization, and also taking into account the ILO UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of teachers, the one of 1966, and the 1997 recommendation concerning the higher education teaching personnel. Well, we also considered the ILO policy guideline on the promotion of decent work for early childhood education personnel, and also the consensus among the ILO tripartite constituents. We also take into consideration the UNESCO recommendation, well, I've already said it, the Education International Constitution, Education International Policy Paper, and the resolutions on trade union rights. But also, taking into account all these existing instruments, we realize a growing number of infringements on trade union rights and non-involvement of teachers and education support personnel in the development of teacher policies. And I think this has already been highlighted by previous speakers. And so we propose 8 fundamental principles for this framework, plus an extra principle to include what has not been taken into account. The first principle is on the ratification of international labor standards and alignment of national labor regulations. Well, where we want, through this, we want to request that government ensure that respect of the fundamental principles and rights at work, as well as the ratification of and implementation of ILO conventions to ensure that national laws and practices conform to the relevant conventions. And the second fundamental principle is about direct negotiations or social dialogue mechanisms. And we want to ensure that there's a direct negotiation or social dialogue mechanism, including collective bargaining, where applicable between public or private employers and their organizations, and trade unions representing educators at national, local, or institutional level, generally leading to a formal collective agreement. And the third principle is on negotiating on terms and conditions, where we want to ensure that there are negotiations on terms and conditions between relevant government authorities and organizations representing teachers and education support personnel, which leads to collective bargaining agreements, published national laws and regulations concerning, covering teachers and education support personnel. And the fourth fundamental principle is on collective agreements, legal settlements, and awards. And here we want to ensure effective implementation of collective bargaining agreements, legal settlements, and awards to ensure that educators maintain high professional standards expected of them and are motivated and properly trained to engage in their work. The fifth fundamental principle is about consultative bodies, where we think, in addition to social dialogue, there should be, we should ensure that trade unions are invited to participate in civil dialogue, including consultative councils, forums, coordinating committees, or other advisory bodies composed of stakeholders to advise education authorities on education policy and practice at national, regional, or local levels. And the sixth principle is on grievance and dispute procedures, where we request that, countries, states should formulate grievance and dispute procedures, clear ones, which could be used as best practice by employers and workers' organizations, and where disputes take place, to encourage the parties themselves to find solutions which are fair and sustainable. And the seventh principle is about involvement of educators in the process of establishing social dialogue mechanism. I think some people who have, some participants who have asked questions have raised this one. Here, through this principle, we want to ensure that national or local social dialogue frameworks, mechanisms, and processes are established with the full involvement of teachers and education support personnel through their representative organizations. And the eighth principle is on training. It has already been said by my predecessors, training on social dialogue. Well, we want countries to provide suitable training and education to educators, to teachers and education support personnel and employers organizations to engage in effective and meaningful dialogue and to ensure that information services are available to support proper collective bargaining and participation in dialogue and consultation, and also incorporate use of evidence and data. This is research, educate and develop skills of educators and their organizations for competence in playing a meaningful role at national level and in spreading the message of the value of dialogue. Well, one thing is to develop social dialogue mechanism. Another thing is to let the beneficiaries or the stakeholders know how to use them. And that's why we think that there should be training on social dialogue. And the extra principle, which is principle 9, is on, well, any other provision. Well, here we think that countries should set up targeted mechanisms such as multi-employer bargaining streams, especially to assist employers and educators to reach agreement on improving remuneration, working conditions, and therefore enhancing efficiency. So in short, this is the structure, this is the framework summarized, but we will share it later for input if possible. Thank you very much, Mbali.
Thank you very much, Bedianawe. Of course, colleagues, now that the EI Africa framework for social dialogue has indeed been presented, we will have at least about 10 minutes set aside for your reactions on the framework. Please use your reactions function to raise your hand if you wish to speak. You can also use the chat box to submit your questions. But before we give or pose any questions to Betty, we will revert back to one of our panelists who couldn't join us a bit earlier on, and his name is Philbert Bates Baguma. Philbert, can we get your perspective when it comes to social dialogue and why it is so important? It's over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And sorry for coming in a bit late. I had another presentation. Social dialogue is a very important tool in as far as the teachers are concerned. For us, for the Ugandan case, we applied social dialogue with the support from UNESCO, and we moved out to some of the regions. The revelations were overwhelming because we realized that much as we make assumptions that the stakeholders do understand what is within their setups, do not actually appreciate what the teachers and the other stakeholders in the school community go through. And some of these issues are the ones that affect the teacher's performance. And therefore, social dialogue, if well structured, can bring results both on the side of the teachers, but also on the side of government. Quite often we have our governments using top-bottom approach in coming out with policies. And these policies are supposed to be implemented by teachers, but teachers are literally not involved at the formulation levels. As a result, you find the teachers are told and given what to implement when they actually don't appreciate the reason why these policies are formulated and the possible consequences. And as such, because of less involvement of the teachers, you will find that some of the provisions therein may be taken negatively by the teachers, and therefore the teachers do not own these policies, which becomes a very big challenge. And therefore, for us to improve on the teachers' welfare, their terms and conditions, we need to use social dialogue as a tool. Actually, for us in the Ugandan case, we have the National Teacher Policy, which has 3 frameworks, and social dialogue is one of the frameworks which we feel, if implemented, will go a long way in harmonizing industrial relations between the employer and the employees, and then will go a long way in improving the teacher's performance, having looked at the issues that affect the teacher in the teaching learning process. And when we conducted these regional dialogues, social dialogues, we invited all stakeholders, not only teachers. We invited all those leaders in the local government setup. We invited teachers, we invited head teachers and heads of education institutions. We invited those who manage the teachers' payroll. Because, you know, even if we talk about all other things, but we forget to look at the management of the payroll, then the effectiveness of the teaching learning process will be definitely affected. And what we realized is that communication is scanty and not effective. And this makes the teachers suffer at the hands of the responsible officers who do not play their part. And as such, the teachers have grievances which remain unattended to. The teachers go through a lot of issues, even those which are school-based, which should be actually sorted out at school level, but they remain unattended to because of the broken communication channels. And we also realize that if we use social dialogue as a tool, it is very easy to have communication flow and identify the structures through which social dialogue can take place and inform the policy formulation right away from the school, the workplace, through the structures of government up to the policy making body, and which would now bring out policies that are friendly and conducive and that would lead to quality education. We talk about the poor performance, but we forget what the teachers go through. And as a result, we remain condemning the teachers when in actual sense, the teachers are not facilitated, the teachers are not supported. And of course, if we don't have motivated, supported, and facilitated teachers, we cannot expect them to deliver quality education, which we all yearn for. So, involvement of teachers' unions, which represent the teachers' issues, is key to sustainable, effective communication and then better outcomes from where teachers can present their views and be heard and be worked upon, and then we get the quality of education we orient for.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Dr. Fulbert Bates. Baguma, if you have any questions for Mr. Baguma, you can make use of our reactions. You can raise your hand, or you can also then pose your questions in our Q&A chat box. So we're going to continue then with our Q&A session, also reacting then to Mr. Bedi Anawi from his presentation and the framework that he presented here to us this morning. And I'm going to start off with Jacques Mwakupemba. His hand has been up for quite some time. Jacques, it's over to you. Please be clear on who you're posing your question to and clarity on the question as well. Hello, Jacques. Okay, let's move on to another person who has also raised their hand. Akile Esolori, your hand is also up.
Yeah, hello.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, that sounded like my name. I needed to be sure I was the one you were calling because my hand has
Yes,
been
it
up.
is indeed yours.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, very beautiful presentation. I'm speaking here from Africa. And as somebody who's worked with the Ministry of Education a lot, I have two questions. And the first one is to Bedi Anawi. And my question goes forth that in an attempt to having social dialogues and trying to get the fundamental principles around it, right? Sorry, I beg your pardon. My question is for Raina. Sorry. My question is for Raina. At the point of trying to get a dialogue together, and you find out that maybe under the preconditions, the people necessary to establish mutual trust, if you do not get their bargain and if you do not get their support, then what do you do to move on from that point? That is very, very important. And my second question here, it goes to Steve Nwokocha. And the question is this: in an attempt to professionalize the teachers, one major question is, how do you help us out in the issue of us when we have people who are teachers by circumstance, and you have a lot of them in the system, and you know that the livelihood is dependent on it. They have children, they have family, and how do you deal with them? And because these ones are not even teachable again. Those two questions from here in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is Dr. Akinpelu, and his questions directed to Raina as well as Dr. Bedi. Let's start with you, Raina, and your response to the question.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a little bit in a similar way like we heard it from Cape Verde, what to do if it does not work properly. So we have to go through these four elements, but specifically on the issue of trust. Yes, that is very difficult. We cannot impose or claim to get trust just so. It cannot be legislated. You have to have trust. Trust you have to earn over time, as it is everywhere in life, also in our private relationships. When we want to come together closer and have a relationship with someone, we try to show the partner that we are trustworthy. And that happens with our wives, with our spouses generally. That happens even also with our children. We have to behave in a way that we become trustworthy. Now, how the other party, we're always looking at the other party. I'm doing everything right, but am I really doing everything right? And the other party also. So if there's any agreements, for instance, collective agreements, a collective agreement is like a promise, and you don't hold up your promise, then you destroy trust. And it is much easier to destroy than to rebuild. trust. So this is a very tricky issue. And if the situation in the country is already difficult, then also rebuilding trust is a difficult process. And social dialogue can help. Social dialogue is a trust-building tool, but it does not create trust automatically. Social dialogue is a process, and it's not a one-time event. So we have to keep on working in the right direction. And this is where the picture with the triangle comes back. If we only look at the peak level, the high intensity sort of form of social dialogue, it is very, very difficult. We have to, in order to build trust, we have to meet without obligations, to see what are my issues, what is their issues. We have to invest time from all sides. We have to invest time. And when there's no obligations, maybe parties speak more openly. Obviously, we will, there's a lot that comes into the game. We have to bring up this respect for each other, mutual respect, not only through the legislation, but also around the negotiation table. If we insult each other because in the past you did something, just like in private life, that will not help me to convince the person to listen to me and to trust me, and that what I now say is the right way. So looking at the past only can help us to learn lessons, but winding up things and going back into the past and accuse the other party all the time will not help from neither side. So we have to look forward, but it's a process. It's a process. We cannot impose it on anyone. And unfortunately, the more that there is at stake, the less persons, people, organizations are ready to open up because they can lose too much. And so we have to start with at a low level, It's a social dialogue is an ongoing process. If we want to reach to the peak, good negotiations, good outcomes, good collective agreements, which also will be implemented, I promise, we have to go all these steps. And that does not sound like we can do it, we can have it tomorrow, but perhaps social dialogue, if it is not there, if the trust is not there today, we cannot have very successful outcome of negotiations in 2 weeks already. So we have to work towards it. And sometimes being too ambitious has also shown that you may get the word from the other side, the promise, okay, then we will do it for God's sake, just to get peace, but it will never happen. So if we are too ambitious, we are maybe no longer realistic. So we have to remain realistic, and it is small steps, and it is a long-term process. That is probably all I can say about trust in a general manner. Afterwards, one has to again look, why don't we trust each other? What has happened in the past? And then to overcome these problems. But that is the general way. I don't know if that can give you an idea how to approach it. What goes wrong? The longer it goes wrong, the more it gets encrusted in problems, and the more difficult it will be to come out of it. We have to make a start at some point in time and be realistic, maybe not overly ambitious, rather carry home small results and with small promises, and do our part also to implement what we have promised. Salaries and payment is one side, but on the other side, also for trade unions, if they promise less absenteeism of teachers, if they promise more investment into the curriculum, if they promise, I don't know what will be promised, maybe good results, that higher portion of students will successfully finish years. I don't know what is in those discussions, but whatever is being discussed also has to be realistic so that
All right, then.
can be done.
Thank you very much, Rainer. We'll then ask then Betty to give his input to some of the questions being raised by Akin a bit earlier on. Can you also respond then, Betty, to the questions raised on the framework?
Thank you, Mbali. I could not identify a clear question concerning the framework, but I thought a question went to Prof. Steve from Dr. Akin, but it doesn't matter. For the framework, what I can say in terms as a summary is that we thought of putting in this frame because our call is to systematize social dialogue. It will help a lot to improve the industrial relations. You know, very generally, teacher unions, unfortunately, are popular in some countries because of strikes. It's just if we believe that if we have systematic social dialogue system mechanism and we implement it, we can avoid such a turbulent movement like strikes. That's why we recommend that this framework be adopted and be used by everybody so that at least the industrial relation with teachers and their organizations can become more peaceful, because we need, this is really needed for education, positive education learning, positive education outcomes. That's my word for now.
All right, thank you very much, Betty. I'm just going to shift gears for a moment, and I'm going to ask all our participants to give us the suggestions on how to strengthen the EI Africa social dialogue framework. Of course, we've had a lengthy presentation from you, Betty. I think it's time for our participants now to give us their inputs in terms of what they suggest should be part of this framework in order for it to be strengthened. I'm also then going to ask for myself to ask my video access to also then be lifted so that I can see all the participants for today. Thank you very much. Is there anybody who would like to go ahead and give us their inputs in terms of strengthening the framework?
Maybe, yes, Mbali, maybe I can come in very briefly as the rest of the panelists get ready to respond as well. I think that a good thing that we've listened throughout this session has to do with the role of participation and the role of different stakeholders. Our colleagues from ILO mentioned tripartite dialogue, which is important. So we have employers, we have government, we have teacher organizations and unions. I think that is very important. And in framing the actual frame of social dialogue, this is more of a reflexive exercise. In framing this framework for social dialogue, we need to also have all of the participants in place. So I'm very happy to participate in this webinar. My recommendation would be to strengthen the framework for social dialogue. We need to hear all of the voices, particularly if it is something that is related to Africa. We know there is a vast number of private providers, private education providers. There's a vast number of contract teachers or teachers who are in the private sector and who do not have the same status as civil servants. Therefore, there are differences in conditions and so on. So I believe these actors should be part and parcel of the development and the application of the framework. So here I would say private sector employers from private institutions that need to be regulated by government, and also the teachers that participate in different contractual forms, whether it is contract teachers, whether it is community teachers, volunteer teachers, and so on. So just to encourage EI and to also stand ready to support them from from the TTF, where Education International sits in the steering committee. So we will be very happy to support this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Is there anybody else who would like to give in their input? They can just unmute and go ahead and give us their suggestions.
Yeah,
yes, I can make.
Okay, let's start with you, Fulbert.
Yes, thank you very much. Of course, looking at the current state of education in Africa, looking at the rising levels.
Okay, Fulbert, we are struggling with your connection.
Commercialization, looking at the deplorable conditions the teachers are working in, it becomes a little bit tricky, and therefore there is a need for governments to come out and have social dialogue framework, and these social dialogue frameworks should be structured in a way that there is flow of communication, because unions in this continent are under attack. And when there is absence of tripartite, it simply means we cannot think of performance at the end of the day. So for us to get the good relationship between the employers and the employees, we need to have a discussion. This is what we are looking at. So that the terms and conditions of teachers.
But unfortunately, your connection is failing you there. We're going to move on. I saw that Akile had his hand up. Akile, can we have your inputs, please? Hello, Akile. Okay, is there anybody else who would like to give us their insights?
Hello?
Yes, there we go. Akile?
Hello.
Yes, you can go ahead, sir.
Yes,
you can go ahead and give us your inputs.
Yes, let's go. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. C'est Laurent Clessor de la Fédération des syndicats de l'éducation nationale du Togo. Nous voudrions féliciter tous ceux qui ont fait leur prestation pour avoir nous éclairé sur un certain nombre de points. Au Togo, nous avons un souci, c'est-à-dire ma question est d'ordre général, c'est-à-dire que quand on parle de dialogue social, cela concerne tous les secteurs. Et depuis un certain nombre d'années auparavant, le gouvernement a promis, a fait un projet des assises de l'éducation nationale qui n'ont jamais eu lieu jusqu'à ce point. Nous, on aimerait savoir si ces échanges ou bien ces assises de l'éducation nationale sont aussi synonymes de ce dialogue social dont vous parlez. Si oui, en étant un syndicat, qu'est-ce que nous devons faire? Quels sont les mécanismes que nous pouvons mettre en place pour que ces assises-là aient vraiment lieu dans notre pays? Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Akile. We're going to move on now to our next session. And thank you very much for all your comments in which you have shared with us. We're now coming to the last part of our webinar, and I'm going to call on the directors of AUC, UNESCO, IICBA, and EI Africa for some closing remarks. We're going to start off with Mr. Hambani Masheleni, and kindly unmute your microphone and also share your reflections on the EI framework and social dialogue and your closing remarks. It's over to you. Mr. Hambani? Okay, well, let's move on to Dr. Quinton Wooden. Maybe perhaps you can also then give us your reflections on the EI framework and social dialogues and your closing remarks. Thank you, sir. It's over to you.
Right. Thank you, Mbali. So first, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I mean, we had a large number of participants. We had key organizations present. And this is a very, very important topic. So we are so happy that you joined us. Rather than commenting my closing remarks on the process of the dialogue, because so much has been said already in the framework, the one piece of information I would like to share is that we are launching a work program at ICBA on measuring the wages and other benefits and living conditions of teachers in many countries. For example, for Francophone Africa, we have data from a household surveys for 10 countries that enables us to look at wages in the public and in the private sector of teachers, and they are very different, whether teachers get different benefits, the rates of poverty. To some extent, we can measure sometimes satisfaction. In Anglophone countries, there are also quite a few surveys that can be used for that. I really believe that social dialogues are fundamental, but we also need to have the data to inform the discussions, how well or how not well are teachers paid, for example, versus others. And I just want to reemphasize again that we need to convince ministries of education as the main employers of teachers to implement surveys to measure the well-being of their teachers, their job satisfactions, their level of burnout, and so on. So I just want to tell all of you that if you do want to interact with us at ICBA, UNESCO, International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, on those issues, we are happy to do that. And I also want to mention that the whole teacher cluster under the Continental Education Strategy for Africa is going to work on those issues. I think all our speakers will be Denise, who will tell us what the next steps in this process is. And we do hope that the framework can be enhanced and adopted so that it really informs discussions at the country level. So let me close here and give the floor back to you, Mbali, for Denise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wooden. We'll try Mr. Hambani Masheleni again. Are you there? Going once, going twice. All right, let's get the reflections from Dr. Dennis Signolo, the Regional Director, and also then just share your reflections on the way forward for EI Africa framework for social dialogue and your closing remarks. Dennis, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Mbali, and thank you very much, colleagues, for your input. It has been very useful, and we're thinking seriously about how we can incorporate it into the draft that we have. But let me emphasize what everybody has been saying. From what I've heard, all of us believe collectively, I believe that social dialogue is crucial if we're to improve decent salaries and working conditions for teachers, if we're to improve the quality of our education systems across Africa. Social dialogue is good for governments, it is good for teachers, it is good for the parents even, and certainly for the students and everybody else. Every other key education stakeholder benefits from institutionalized social dialogue. But I would like to also point out the critical need for us to make a distinction between social dialogue and what UNESCO calls social participation or policy dialogue. Social dialogue is explained by the ILO in this particular context is either tripartite, meaning involving workers' organizations, governments, and employers. In the case of the public sector, the government, as I said earlier on, is both the regulator and the employer. Sometimes it takes the form of bipartisan. In the case of the education sector, the public sector, it would be the government and teachers and education support personnel represented by their unions engaging with the government. That's social dialogue. And we would like as educators to protect that definition. It's critical to improving the working conditions of teachers. This is also based on experience. We have had countries that have engaged with civil society and they've claimed that we consulted with civil society, therefore there is social dialogue. We are not, by suggesting in any way that there shouldn't be involvement of all other key stakeholders. No, all the education stakeholders should be involved in policy dialogue. This includes students, this includes parents, civil society, NGOs, and others. I hope the distinction is clear. We would like to protect the ILO definition of social dialogue and at the same time push for the involvement of all partners in defining, in informing education policy. That is critical. So we will have to figure out whether this framework should be opened up to include everybody else, or whether we need another separate instrument, which will then look at social participation, I'm borrowing UNESCO language, or policy dialogue to complement this one. So we would like to get the thoughts of the partners who are with us as we reflect further on the inputs that we have received and how we can capture that particular element without losing the main focus, which is to try and improve the working conditions of teachers through social dialogue. Let me emphasize again that social dialogue can be effective, but only if it is protected by legislation. So it should be enshrined in law, particularly in the constitution of the country and the labor law of the country. And there should be a mechanism for conducting effective social dialogue. And effective social dialogue should be based on trust. And it should be based on the principle of equal partners. So when we engage in social dialogue, we're equal partners. I remember one day when we're meeting with a government official, and the government official says, the union president who was part of the EI delegation, he says, oh, this is my staff member. So no, when we're engaging in social dialogue, we're equal partners. So already that was negotiating in bad faith. So it should be based on good faith. The generation of evidence, capacity building are critical if teacher unions, for example, are to engage effectively in social dialogue. And certainly, if civil society organizations, students organizations, parents, and others are to engage effectively in policy dialogue, that is also critical. Education International is currently conducting a global survey on the status of teachers and the teaching profession. It's a big study we do every 3 years. And the evidence from this survey will help us to engage effectively with the committee that Carlos referred to earlier on, which is the Joint ILO-UNESCO Committee of Experts on the status of teachers, the CEAD, but also with all the other processes that are happening. For example, the UN's High-Level Commission on Teachers, which was launched a few weeks ago. That's another great opportunity for us to engage. But also, of course, as we heard from Habani Masheleni, 2024 is the year of education. So as Education International, we're proposing to the African Union 2 major events next year. One on education financing, because if we don't release more resources through domestic funding of education, supported by external support, we cannot be able to improve the working conditions of teachers. We cannot be able to provide infrastructure, teaching and learning resources. So that's one event, big event, pledging conference, bringing together the African Union, the Global Partnership for Education, asking African governments to commit to increasing domestic financing of education. The second event is on teachers. We propose to the African Union that next year there be a big event focusing on revitalizing the teaching profession, which is the first objective of the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. Let me just end by saying this, colleagues, we have come to the end of the webinar, but the end of the webinar is not really the end. It is but the beginning of a new impetus to strengthen social dialogue in Africa, to ensure decent salaries and working conditions for teachers and education support personnel, to improve teaching and learning in all our classrooms. As teachers ourselves, we care so deeply about our students and of course about our members too. So as the Organization of Teachers and Education Support Personnel, Education International commits to continue to work with the African Union and with its member states, as well as all the partners who are part of this conversation today. And we invite everyone to continue to work with us to make social dialogue a reality in Africa. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, the UNESCO, ICPA. Thank you, Quentin, and your team in Addis. We appreciate you. The African Union Commission, Director Mban Masheleni, Cassidy, everybody else, we thank you so much. The ILO, yes, we thank even our friend Oliver, who could not be here, but we appreciate Renee, who was able to join us today. Thank you so much. The Teacher Task Force, Carlos, and your team in Paris, we appreciate you, and we continue to build this together. So in the way forward is as follows. We will take all the input we have received, look carefully at it, including what you submitted through the charts, and then revise the framework, and then discuss it within the teacher development cluster. Once it has been shared within the teacher development cluster of the African Union, and people have agreed in terms of the inputs integrated, we'll then hand it over to the African Union Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also thank the speakers. Thank you so much, everybody, and the panelists, but also join me in thanking the interpreters. They've made it possible for us to be able to talk to each other. Otherwise, thank you so much. We will meet in another session very soon, I'm sure. And this is a good lesson, I believe, Quentin, that we can organize another big webinar and make it open like this one, focusing on some of the critical aspects that are coming. Thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you very much, Dennis. Of course, as you have heard, their colleagues, it is indeed, we have come to the end of our webinar. And of course, a lot of work there still needs to be done, as outlined by Dennis Signol. I'd like to thank you all for participating in this very important session on social dialogue. And a very big thank you to everyone who participated today, including the speakers, panelists, as well as the interpreters. Again, till next time, thank you very much for your time. It has been great to moderate this session. Till next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mbali.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye.